Let me introduce you to Reiji Nagaoka, who is a PhD student here at Manchester Metropolitan University, the LUDEC-funded scholar. That's a specific Leverhulme scheme that is the Leverhulme unit for the design of future cities. And his research is very much interdisciplinary, bringing together game studies, environmental studies, and urban planning. And his research project is called Revitalizing Future Cities, Cognitive Climate Behavior, and it's quite a long title, in an online multiplayer environmental video game. And his talk today is going to introduce part of that project. So the title behind cyber cities and eco-crystal framework analysis of virtual cities. So I'll hand over to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much. Slight disclaimer. This is the intro slide, and this was the abstract I sent in early March, but for reasons I'll show in time. The actual topic of the talk is slightly different. As Paul pointed out, urban studies, game studies, behavioral studies, those are my three kind of areas. And through that, I'm investigating urban climate futures, player behavior, and how players interact with each other or view collaboration as a strategy for dealing with climate change in conditions of generalized trust. That last bit builds upon Professor Sakhanov's work on game theory. So we're going to do something on cyber cities, which would be fun and nice and visual. But in kind of researching this, I found that the conceptualization of eco games in current literature is kind of limits how I can do this. So fake out title screen is replaced by that one. So I've developed a conceptual framework for kind of incorporating both players and empirical evidence for the real world effects of playing eco games or environmentally focused video games. So currently, said there, the literature is largely based in the humanities, where there's lots of theoretical stuff, and the kind of structural kind of evolution of eco games has some kind of core contentions that I argue has prevented or kind of questions their promotion or widespread promotion. So brief little sort of literature review of kind of domain and what people think eco games can do. So in 2008, I think Barton produced a paper which talked about the inclusion of real world system or processes within games, arguing that in doing so would increase kind of cognitive conceptualization of climate change. And then that call has been echoed throughout eco game literature since the past 12 years, 13 years, 15 years. And this most recently resulted in the United Nations producing something called the Playing for the Planet report, which links the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, with eco games to say that these can raise awareness for the environment. It consists of a form of learning, non-traditional learning, and through games we can then influence real world environmental behaviors. And that those two kind of core ideas underpin the majority of eco game literature. Which dovetails nicely into Paolo's stuff with the environment, narratives, and rules. This is kind of a summarization of the makeup or the formal components of a game. So you have the kind of spatial conditions, the storytelling aspects, and the player potentiality within the game. And those interact, they're interdependent, and kind of equally contribute to the structure of the game, guided by game design practices to make it somewhat fun to play. But of course, they're also abstractions of real world systems processes as well. And so through abstracting these processes and putting them within games, we can start to combine the underexplored area of cultural climate change communication with the kind of environmental system simulation to some degree. And the current kind of dynamic paradigm of relying upon kind of cataclysmic environment imagery to inspire us to take action, or sharing of graphs as well, as well. and just saying, the world's getting warmer, what can we do about it? We're just kind of showing that it's happening, but neither of those so far had that much effect, really. And so, how do video games change real behaviors? For the majority of eco-game scholars, this is using the theory of procedural rhetoric, where by Bogart 2007, who states that as computational processes at their heart, computer games are ultimately driven by player choice, inherent in their format. And this kind of interaction between player interaction and the game is a form of dialogue. And seeing as you're communicating with the player, you can then use these processes to mount arguments, to persuade players through in-game play, linking that to real cognition of the game systems. And as abstractions of real systems, you can then foster more criticality in the real world. And that's a summary of all those kind of major points of how eco-games potential is, or the arguments for eco-game potential is constructed in current literature. So, what are the problems here? So, yeah, the aforementioned Playing for the Planet report, they do have a section on case studies and the impacts that eco-games have had. This consists of a list of donations to various environmental programs around the world. They do present the game Eco by Strange Loop Games, but without any mention of how it informs players, raises awareness, anything. It just says it reveals unsustainable production and consumption processes. And then reviewing further literature reveals that there is a significant gap in the empirical evidence that's used to support these claims. Where the claims do exist, particularly for eco games, the studies are very limited in that they are typically using younger participants who are shown to care more about climate change anyway. They are set in education institutions and have a unequal bias on the gender spectrum, which, if you look at the actual average player, they're 31 years old and 55% female. I mean, they just did a binary survey there, didn't count all of the spectrum on that survey. So it's actually misrepresenting, there's limited applicability to actual players. F in the chat. So they don't really haven't been proven to have any effect, really. And so coming to that sort of realization, starts to look at the core theoretical component that underpins the translation of in-game and real behaviors, and that is procedural rhetoric. With a further kind of review on 60 studies revealed that the scientific process of these studies were questionable, with no control groups, and where there was a control group in one of the studies, there were no significant learning differences between playing the game and giving someone a document to read with all the same information. So there's quite a large looming question mark over whether they, through this particular form of theory of kind of game learning. And I think what's interesting to see on this kind of theory is how players are conceptualized. So players are real, they exist as people, and they temporarily inhabit like a game, an avatar. Whereas the kind of proceduralist perspective on it is players are formal components, and we can look at just like environment, narratives, and rules, and we can predict their behavior, and those behaviors are containable by the game's rules, because if we want to mount arguments using them, we can deploy some type of rhetoric to make them think about certain things. But in doing so, just as with the ENRs, you abstract real people, which you're then elevating the role of designer and then importing all these assumptions about players, which is not actually sort of, well, could or could not be true. So there's a major sort of question mark over what is a player, what is a real player, and what is a game player, or in-game player. Yeah, so digging deeper down into that then, so how to answer these questions. Again, there's kind of a trend here. There's a lack of empirical evidence to suggest or to conceptualize player identities within games. So game players to the environment narratives and rules. You have Barton and things like that who tried, well, you did create a framework. And this has been kind of splintered off into different things, but there's quite a fragmented literary body around it. And again, no empirical evidence. Yeah, this was actually informed by Alex Brook as well, who's another PhD student here. It's very helpful in this study. Shout out. Yeah, so there's that kind of problem as well. So there's a lack of, there we go. So yeah, the monetary value or the monetary kind of donations is the main argument for the potential power of eco games for real world change. Yet the studies on in-game player behavior and how they're influenced, which is called eco games, does not really support this, real world behavior changes. And that's both in the studies on persuasive games and the lack of understanding of player identities. So the most recent conceptualization of eco games comes from Abraham, who discusses their material realities, draws attention to their production and consumption, and where it's 0.04% of emissions globally video games can be accounted for. It doesn't seem like a lot. It's equivalent to a whole country. It's quite a lot. But there's also limited research currently, again, data on the kind of life cycle of those as well. So you're talking from the mining, the extraction, the manufacture, life cycle, waste, and e-waste, of course, is a terrific problem, and microplastics as well. So that material, like locating those in the material world, does then draw attention to how we're conceptualizing video games for real world change. And in doing so, he proposes, I would argue, is the first definition that clearly links a game to real world change through players. But he additionally conceptualizes players in a much more expansive way, acknowledging that by addressing the materiality of games, you can minimize the impact of ideological resistance, because once you've bought the game, you're an active participant in preventing climate change. Bought the game. And so you have this idea of a real player buying a game, real world environments, in-game environments. Happy days. So we've got a link there. Oh, yes. And that's yeah. So these are that's the summary of the key argument of key arguments that are presented in UK scholarship, and the kind of defining them through the internalities, so understanding them through the game, and the externalities, understanding materially backwards. So all this stuff, and trying to find a way to categorize them or put them all together, understand the entire domain, led to me creating this. So player focused and data, addressing the two major problems that I identified. The concepts here separate real and game stuff. So you have real environment. So say if you're physicalities, processes, attributes, whatever. If you're looking at water cycles, it would be rainfall and things like that. Real players are me and you, and acknowledging that we all have embedded ethics, we all have ideas, practices, and you can't just reduce those to what you think a player should be within a game. And speaking of, you have the environments, narratives, rules, the players, and they're located in there as well, because you there is a connection between those. You're locating within the internalities of the game, but they're connected to their real counterparts in some form. And then incorporating Abraham's most recent addition to the field, materiality. Right. And so this kind of proposes looking at games as a more through relationships, I suppose, understanding how the barrier, the real game barriers cross, and stressing the importance of empirical evidence to do that. Like that, and that's all so the arrows point to what's informing what. So the real world environment comes back down and abstract those into there, and then the players have a joint relationship like that. And then materiality is all the way over. Yeah, like that. So these concepts are kind of more containers, I suppose, than these really rigid things. So if we review existing frameworks, the authors of two of those in the room. So we can kind of draw these and incorporate them into this, into these conceptual categories. So these are subcomponents, and these can be linked to another. They don't have to relate upwards either. And some of them, this uses Abraham and Germain's conceptualization of environments in games, where particularly for ENRs, they can be multiple and dynamics. They change through the game. So something like Dark Souls has the environment as an antagonist, but you have item descriptions which inform the narrative, will tell you what's going on. So it's simultaneously text as well, for example. And environments become, and as an example of how things change, I think in the first Dark Souls, you can see one of the late game areas, Analondo, in an early game area. So it's a backdrop then. Then as soon as you enter it, it becomes, it's quite environmentally, it's a very tricky little segment. So it becomes an antagonist there. So if we link all that together, we get that fun little map. Goes off the top, but that links it back down as before. So these are the main kind of themes identified, and the subcomponents of those. And you can see where the line is there, the arguments that are used transfer all this understanding and justify it connected to players. But as you sort of hopefully have clarified, the awareness education action bit using procedure rhetoric there's no evidence base for it, and it doesn't account for what Abraham draws attention to, the identity, the ideology, things like that at the top, to then question the real world environments. So to link it back to what I was originally going to talk about, is we have can you see a mouse on there? Yeah, okay. So we have this whole bit that we care about and we want to protect. And we have this little bit here, which is us. So how does this work here? We don't have any evidence to show how that works. But then dually, there's currently no clear empirically backed connection between this and this. So my research kind of looks at how we understand the environments, narrative and rules, connections to in-game players, and conceptualizing what in-game player is. So hopefully someone else, far smarter, can link this up to here with all this stuff involved. Oh, there's a summary. Summary of that. So account. So it does try and draw in and build upon the huge amount of literature that's inherited by eco games from game studies. The questions of climate and communication from field of climate change communication. but also recognizes the need to validate these claims through data, which doesn't really happen. But data and players specifically, understanding how players behave when you reveal the systemic effects of their climate actions. Oh, right. Sorry.
I think Reiji, I might start applauding because we're running short.
Sugar. There we go. Thank you.